Brianna lives in Columbia with her husband, Scott, and two children, Ryan and Isabel. And she's always been active in local community affairs with the City of Columbia New Century Fund, the Greenbelt Land Trust, and also with MU Women's and Children's Patient and Family Advisory Council. So I'm reading from something. Is Brianna there right now, or?
I am.
Hi, Brianna. Thank you. We're skipping announcements and just hearing from you now. Her talk will be is titled Reflections on the November 8th election, which I know we've been really excited about what we were all able to do in that election. Thank you for being here, Brianna.
Yeah, thank you. I am going to share my screen really briefly because I do have a little PowerPoint. Can people see that? Okay. I'm trying to get it to come over. Okay. So 2022, obviously, first, thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation. 2022, I think everyone knew that there were changes that were going to happen, but we weren't quite sure what the outcomes would be. We weren't quite sure how it was going to affect voters. And while I can't answer all of the questions about what kind of impact some of the law changes had and just generally, you know, voter behavior and turnout and things like that in 2022, I do want to focus on what it was that changed the most, what the impacts were for our office, for voters, and then some things that, some data that we collected from the election, and then some things that we, as county clerks, as the County Clerks Association, focus on as our priorities moving into this legislative cycle, since that's really relevant. The legislature is now in session, in anticipation of the 2024 elections, which will be very big because of the presidential election and U.S. Senate race. So first, I will just start with the fact that House Bill 1878 went into effect on August 28th. So focusing specifically on November, the August election did not have this bill in effect. November did. And so by the time that we had to implement the provisions of 1878, we had already had to do voter education for August, and then we had to shift gears and start educating people on what the new process would be. And is everybody seeing, as I'm scrolling down this, is it changing slides for you? Okay. So what that meant was photo ID. Photo ID was now required. The valid IDs were Missouri driver's licenses, non-driver's licenses, U.S. passports, and U.S. military ID. Those could not be expired, with the caveat that if they were expired, they must have expired after the date of the last general election. By and large, I think our experience was that there were quite a few people that had expired licenses, but it was a very large margin for the date because it went all the way back to the day after the November 2020 election. Now, as we move forward, if you have an expired license for the April election, for example, you can only have it be expired the day after the November 2022 election. So it moves along with the elections because it's whatever the last general election was. So by the time we get to 2024, we'll have 2022 all the way through 2024, but for now, it will just be these last few months. So that's something that's a little bit tricky to educate people on, but it will be something that we have found ways to kind of bake that into the process so that poll workers at least aren't confused, so voters shouldn't have to worry about getting mixed signals or things like that at the polls. No longer valid IDs, which people were very used to presenting when they went to vote, or voter ID cards, sample ballot mailings that came from our office, both of those. the student IDs, the University of Missouri employee IDs, out-of-state driver's licenses, which were really big for a lot of out-of-state students. And then the one that surprised a lot of people, even though it impacts a small number, but still a very important demographic of voters, is the Safe at Home cards. So Safe at Home cards are voters that are in the Safe at Home program, which is administered by the Secretary of State's office. It makes their address confidential. It gives them a P.O. box to send their mail to, so that and even for voter registration goes beyond that to make their name even confidential. So if you were to ask for a voter list, those names are just unique codes that even I don't get the information for. The Secretary of State's office sends us a letter that says, this code is assigned to this precinct, please register them to vote. And that Safe at Home card that they receive from the Secretary of State's office is a valid ID for showing that they're a participant in the Safe at Home program. But because of the photo ID requirement, Safe at Home participants had to show both the Safe at Home card, because it had the unique code on it. A poll worker could not look up a Safe at Home person under their name because it doesn't exist in the voter registration system, only the code does. And then they'd have to follow up by showing a photo ID. So Safe at Home voters had this dual process. I can tell you from personal experience helping a couple of these voters vote absentee and hearing on election day, it was pretty clunky. It's not an easy process to explain, especially to Safe at Home voters that have the whole purpose of participating in the program be confidentiality. So we had tried to stem that on election day. We had sent letters and emails to the Safe at Home participants that we had contact information for, to tell them, if you want to vote in this election, this is the change that went into effect. Absentee voting is an option for you, and you can come directly to our office. You can vote in person, and our staff can work with you on this if you don't want to worry about going to a polling place. Pam, do you have a question on that?
What is the Safe at Home card used for besides? Okay, I understand why, but why would you use it? Where would you present it?
It expands to different things. If you're using the P.O. box as an official address on, various state forms and things like that, it's helpful to have that card just to show why you happen to have a Jefferson City P.O. box as your address instead of a residential Boone County one.
Okay.
So for voters that did not have a photo ID when they went to go vote in November, they could be issued a blue provisional ballot. This is an example of the blue provisional ballot. It required 2 judges of the opposite political parties to oversee the process. They followed the provisional ballot checklist that we issued to them. The voter filled out a ballot, same type of ballot as everybody else, but they had to then put it in the blue envelope, fill out the outside of the blue envelope. The judges had to fill out the outside of the blue envelope, and then it was put in a provisional ballot slot on the voting machine. That ballot was counted after the election during the certification process, and only if the signature on that blue envelope matched the signature on the voter registration record. So what that looks like is, after the election, we have a bipartisan team come into the office and they adjudicate each of these. So they would look at the voter registration, they would look at the blue provisional envelope, they would make the determination as to whether it should be counted, and then when they were done processing all of them, those ballots were then tabulated and added to the final result total. So it took longer. We were not sure, we over-prepared all of our polls. We provided hundreds of provisional ballots out there because we weren't sure how many it would be. And this is the part where I think it's really important to also look at data when you're talking about who is impacted by provisional ballots. Keeping in mind that we had a very low voter turnout comparatively to 2018, but pretty on par with 2014. So 2018 was more of an anomaly that we had so much voter turnout. 2014 was pretty comparable with what we had in 2022. You'd think we're a college town. The people impacted this are going to be college students. this is very clearly going to be something where all these 18 to 24-year-olds are going to be the ones predominantly casting provisional ballots. We said we'll send them out to the Hearn Center. We'll have these for all those different polling places. Then we got the provisional ballots back, and that was not at all who was using blue provisional ballots, which was fascinating to me. I still don't exactly know what we're going to do with this information, but as you can see on this chart, the oldest voter we had using one of these was 102 years old. So a lot of these voters, if you look at the end of the age spectrum, 60 to 102, these are people that are in nursing homes and retirement centers that have given up their driver's license because they don't need it anymore. They no longer have a form of identification issued by the state or issued by the federal government because they just don't need it anymore. These are people that were using the sample ballot or the voter ID card that came in the mail for them, and now they have to fill out a blue provisional ballot. So these are voters knowing this and knowing these numbers. Even with our low turnout, we had just over 300 total provisional ballots cast. These are really the ones that were predominantly impacted. I was really surprised to see the higher numbers in the 30 to 39 category. You know, there's only so much that we can glean out of this data. We can guess that maybe that's people that have out-of-state licenses and haven't yet updated to Missouri licenses before. We are also a very transient community for young professionals. So the important thing and why I wanted to point this out is, you know, we have all of these ideas and these thoughts about who's going to be impacted by these different laws, and then the data comes out and it kind of throws some of those expectations into question as to why it does look this way. And like I said, I don't have all the answers as to why it looks this way. It does help us a little bit in preparation for future elections as to what to expect and where we should be putting blue provisional ballots the most and things like that. But that's what the data says. There's a question. Yeah.
My question is, are these the number of blue provisional ballots that were in, I don't know, how many of these were, how many were approved, I guess is my question.
So of the 296 that we received, I think we only rejected like 9. And it wasn't for signature match issues. There were 2 where the voter did not sign the blue envelope. And so that was technically a signature mismatch because we didn't have the signature on it. But the only other reasons that the envelopes were rejected is if there's another class of provisional ballot called the yellow provisional ballot. That's for if we can't determine the eligibility of the voter. So like they're not on the poll book, we don't know why they're not on the poll book, or they're at the wrong polling location. There were some blue provisional ballots that the voter was in the wrong poll. And so we couldn't count it because they weren't eligible to vote there, but there was nothing wrong with the actual blue provisional ballot. And these numbers include all of them, whether they were rejected or not. I just wanted to, this is who cast them completely. But yeah, by and large, blue provisional ballots were accepted, except for that handful. Yes, Sarah has a question.
This is a nitpicky question. If, for instance, I was a person who showed up to the wrong polling place and I had filled that out and my vote didn't get counted, was I later notified like, oops, you were at the wrong polling place, you really need to go to the church instead, or?
No, so with the number of provisionals that we get, the way the process works is every voter gets a little stub off their provisional ballot envelope. It has a number on it. And so if they call us, because we don't always have phone or email or anything like that too. So if they call us, we can look them up based on their code and then we can tell them. Usually I'd say, like from my experience, usually we get 1 or 2 calls like that, but not too many. And a lot of people are kind of just satisfied to know that they cast a ballot. And I don't know that they think about this, the back end processes too much.
Yeah, thanks.
The other big change that happened with this election is that this was the first time that any voter could cast an absentee ballot without stating a reason 2 weeks before Election Day. So that was essentially colloquial known as early voting so that people could come into the office before Election Day. They didn't need any reason to do it. They just had to show up and they could vote. So this was another place where we looked at the data of where, and we, so this number is for the percentage of these polling places that voted by absentee. So it's not strict numbers. It's not like, oh, the most people that voted were in 1A and 3D. It's just proportional to the number of voters that are in 1A. Proportionally more people voted absentee than in other places. So I think our highest number proportionally was like 30% of a precinct voted absentee as opposed to on Election Day. So it gives us some sense, just looking at what this map means. These are places where absentee voting was popular. And it wasn't just the 2 weeks of absentee voting, it was also people that were eligible to vote absentee for the entirety of the 6 weeks. So that's why if you look at, for example, 6D, that's where Lenore Woods is. So everybody that lives at Lenore Woods is likely eligible in one way or another to vote absentee because of the incapacity or injury rule for absentee voting. So they probably didn't take advantage of the no excuse absentee voting, but they were absentee voting during the 6-week period. So these are areas where, you know, from the elections administration standpoint, we can say, okay, these are the kind of voters that liked to vote absentee. If we're going to do things in the future that expand that, or we do pop-ups again, let's consider putting them in some of these places so that we can get as many people to vote absentee as possible. From the administration standpoint, we think it's very important for absentee voting to happen because it reduces the lines at polling locations on Election Day. It allows us to process people faster, and it just reduces the risk of if something does go wrong, or if there's a issue at a polling place or something like that, voters have additional chances if they come to vote absentee. So everything doesn't have to go 100% right on one single day for everything to be good for voters. This gives them an expanded period. It also helps us to prepare better for the election. Yeah, Kathy, you have a question?
Yes, I didn't see any numbers. I just saw the highlighting of the precincts, but how many voters, how many people voted absentee?
So our total number of absentee voters for this election, let me look real quick. We had for the no excuse period, we have 5,938 people. So it was pretty decent. And then we had a total of about 8,500 absentee voters. So of that 8,500, almost 6,000 of them were during the no excuse absentee period. So that was good. I was hoping it would be more like 10,000, but we'll get there. I also think just from what we experienced, there were a lot of people that weren't aware that absentee voting was available. It's very confusing to have a 6-week absentee voting period and then a 2-week free-for-all period. So we're still working on ways to better kind of make that explainable. We had a lot of college students that were kind of confused by the whole thing. So by and large, I think everybody that used it had a great reaction. We're very happy, plan to do it again. So that was very positive. But I think that there were a lot of people out there that realized after the fact it was available and would have taken advantage of it, but didn't really think about it at the time. Yep, there's one more question.
My question has to do with what were you able to calculate whether there was any additional cost related to all these new provisions? Did the election cost more as a result?
We have not finalized, our election costs take about 2 months to finally do because of ongoing bills and things like that. But it's interesting. It's something that I'll definitely look into. Some of it is variable with, like when we do a pop-up event, we got to reuse a lot of the stuff that we bought in 2020. And so that didn't add extra costs. We also use our own staff. And so like when I go out and I do things, which is when we do the pop-ups, I'm the one going out and doing it. It doesn't add any staff costs because I'm doing it. Is that sustainable long-term? Probably not, but it's working for now. So we'll keep doing it to keep costs down. But that's a great question. It actually dovetails really nicely into the next part I wanted to talk about, which is a little known provision of the law that actually had a huge impact on our election, both administratively and on how we need to plan in the office, in addition to the really great impact it had on voters. So prior to this election, if you were a voter that was living in Boone County, but you were registered in another county, you had to register in Boone County by the 4th week before the election. So if you moved into Boone County 2 weeks before Election Day, you were out of luck. You didn't have an option. If you were trying to do the right thing, move to your new place, registered to vote, you got a letter from us that said, sorry, you're too late to vote and you'll be able to vote in the next election, but not this time. Now, this is something that changed because of the County Clerks Association, who said it doesn't make any sense that we have a statewide voter registration database. We can see if somebody was registered in Callaway and moving into Boone County. Why do we have this arbitrary rule that says that those voters can't become our voters leading up to Election Day or on Election Day? So we were successful in getting that into 1878. Which meant that, for example, and this was a lot of college students, but also just people that were moving across county lines and didn't realize that this would have been a problem for them. If a voter's currently registered in St. Louis, they moved to Boone County, they could still vote, but on Election Day, they had to come to our office to do it. Leading up to Election Day, they could do it online, no big deal. Everything was exactly the same. Voters saw absolutely no difference, but all those people that normally would have been told, sorry, you can't vote, could vote, which was a fantastic change. Now, for the people that were going to vote on Election Day and had to update their address, that's where we were not exactly prepared for the number we were going to have. And we talked to county clerks from across the state. Everybody had this because we were just shocked that people would actually come to our office to take advantage of it. I mean, we hear the thing about elections administration is that we hear from people that don't ever want to change their polling place. So we thought, okay, well, if they're at a polling place and they're told you can vote, but only if you go downtown, we didn't think very many would take advantage of that. And we were very wrong, as were all of the other counties. Every county said that they had a line of people that wanted to do this. Now for ours was particularly funny because having the Hearn Center as a central polling location was wonderful. And some of the student offices there decided to get golf carts to transport people across campus to be able to go to the Hearn Center. When they realized that this rule was in place, they started using the golf carts to send them to our office. So we would suddenly get this line of 40 people because they sent their little caravan of golf carts to our office, which was great, but not something we were expecting to do as we're trying to answer phone calls and deal with voters and everything else that's happening. And we got them all voted. The best part is, although it was an issue, obviously, on Election Day to try to do all of this, and it was kind of chaotic, all of those people that showed up to vote there would have been considered yellow provisional ballots because they wouldn't have been on the poll book, and we would have had to say, you're registered in St. Louis County, you can vote this yellow provisional ballot, but that's all that we can do for you, and it ultimately wouldn't have counted. So, although we had 296 blue provisional ballots to count, we only had 30 yellow provisional ballots, which is unheard of. Normally we have like 150 in a larger election. So it kind of, balanced out a little bit when it came to like our workload, but it also meant that people that normally couldn't vote got the opportunity to vote. And I will note, this change is, it's not same day registration. It's only for people that were registered somewhere else in Missouri. If you came in our office and said, I moved here from Illinois, sorry, we can't do anything for you. Because the whole reason was we can see an active registration in another county. We just have to pull it into our office. So that was a change that happened behind the scenes that I don't think very many people kind of knew about going into it or really kind of after, but it was an interesting one that had a really good impact. And I think it will moving forward too. A lot of people will be able to use that provision. So moving forward into 2023, 2024, what we think about as a Clerks Association, what I think about even in Boone County, we would love to expand the no excuse absentee voting period to 6 weeks. We have always wanted it to be 6 weeks. I would love for it to be 6 weeks, not just because that's, you know, the right thing to do. There's not going to be, you know, when it comes down to it, there's not going to be that many people on week 6 and week 5 coming in to vote that early. We don't see that. But from a simplicity standpoint and from a voter education standpoint, it doesn't easily inform people to say we have 6 weeks of absentee voting and then this 2 week of other things. So I would love to just streamline it, make sure that everybody has the ability to use this. They're coming into our office anyway. The 6 week voting period is in our office. We're in control of the entire polling process. Voters get in my opinion, the best service that they can have because we're full-time people that are here every day and we know the answers to all the questions and have the ability to call the DMV if we need to and do all of the different things that a voter might need. So we would love to have that. We would love, this is a little known thing, but there's just some weird little issues with provisional ballot law where it says that we can't use provisional ballots during absentee voting for the blue provisional ballots. So if you came in and you didn't have a photo ID and you wanted to vote during that 2 week early voting period, we had to turn you away and say the only thing you can do is come on election day and vote a blue provisional ballot, which we can't give you right now because the law doesn't specifically say we can do that. And that's just an oversight of the way that everything was written, as happens in 58-page long bills. So we definitely want to clean that kind of thing up. And then the two other things are they're not because of anything that's happened in Boone County. They're not because of anything I think will happen in Boone County, but they have happened in other places, and they are things that a lot of election administrators think of, especially to protect poll workers, because poll workers are the ones that are the front lines of anything that happens on election day. So one of those is expanding the electioneering distance from 25 feet to 75 feet for absentee voting and election day voting. Ours is one of the smallest distances in the country. Most of them at least have like 50 feet. And so our proposal of 75 feet is kind of to just split the difference and say, you know, I think it's great that people are out there and shaking hands and things like that. It's interesting to hear from other counties where one was just aghast that I talked to in August because their county had never had yard signs at polling locations before. And he was like, oh my gosh, all these people put up these yard signs and people were so mad. It was like all the voters were angry because why would you infringe your politics on my right to vote? Like it was a whole thing, which, you know, here we do that all the time. It's a totally reasonable thing to do. But yeah, there are some counties that it's just every county has a different atmosphere and way of doing things. And so 75 seemed to be the thing everybody could agree on. And then protections for staff and poll workers to make sure they have a pathway to preventing and addressing any harassment and violence. We've seen this in other states. My concern is always that we make sure that none of the protections that we would put in place infringe on anybody's right to vote or intimidate voters in any way. But there are situations, and one of the Georgia poll workers that dealt with this exact instance is receiving a presidential medal today for what she had to put up with, because there was nothing that anybody could do to protect her. She was subject to doxing and personal threats and had to go into hiding for a while, and there were no laws on the books to do anything about that. Her employer really couldn't protect her in any way. And it's changed her whole life, her whole career trajectory. And we want to make sure that there's something at least that tries to incentivize people to not do that. So that is the other kind of area where we're looking at as elections administrators. And there's two questions. David is on the top, so we'll start with David.
My question was, I just want to refer you to the chat. Dave Taylor put out a question on your previous screen asking about payroll costs for, did you need temporary employees for the 2 weeks of early voting or any kind of extra costs?
Yes, we did actually, and that was an increased cost. We hired normally we conduct all of our absentee voting in the office and by our staff. We used our supervisors, our poll worker supervisors, in shifts to sign up for our 2 weeks of no excuse absentee voting that happened down in commission chambers. And that is something that I think as no excuse absentee catches on and things like that, that will be an increased cost from this office. We can still handle some of the things like pop-up locations and things like that, but on a daily basis, in order to make sure the election actually functions and the people that are doing jobs like putting the poll workers at the polling places and making sure our ballots are all protected and checked and everything, we need to have absentee voting outside of the office. So they're going to have to, we will have to do that. And Dave Taylor was one of them, worked with me in Ashland and came to the commission chamber. So he was amazing and I appreciate him. Kathy.
My question was, and maybe you were going to get to this, but I was wondering how much opposition there is in the legislature to the 4 issues that you're would be proposing to be addressed.
Yeah, so I would say the biggest one that has opposition is the 6 weeks absentee period. We do have some legislators that have been really good champions of our questions and things. That's how we got, I think, the change to make sure that people that were moving across counties could still register and vote in time. But we as an association put out a number of resolutions that we are in favor of. We don't ever necessarily expect them all to pass, but we just like to make sure that we're on record in support of that. There's a number of other things that we do just as an aside for an association. We have a resolution that says we are against a closed primary system. And the closed primary legislation is already proposed and on the calendar and things like that. That will be something that comes up in the legislative session. And, we as an association think that that's not the right way to go for elections administration in Missouri. So I think that it won't be an easy path. Elections is still a hot topic for a lot of people. I've been very encouraged by the fact that, you look at other states and you see that they've been inundated with a lot of kind of like fringe opinions, I would say. It's the nicest way to put it, where they want to do things like gut the entire elections administration system. There are a few of those that have been filed. One in particular says that we should not be using voting machines at all anymore. We have to actively prepare for that too. We kept really good notes. One of the things that happens in the certification process period is we do hand count a number of ballots to make sure that our machines were operating correctly. And so we kept track of how long it took for us to do that hand counting and how many races we actually counted and how many times we had to recount it because the numbers didn't match because there was a stack of 10 ballots where there were supposed to be 11. It's fraught with error, and we're doing our best to make sure that those kinds of ideas people have the right and correct information on. But our ideas, we put out there, we hope that they get there. We're happy that 2 weeks of absentee voting is even exists. So I'll be happy with wherever we can get. Herb, you're still on mute though. I can't unmute you. Maybe Alice can.
Dave, can you
It does
unmute?
come out
Joe?
better if I fix the sound, doesn't it?
Yeah, only Herb can do
Thank
it.
you for being our clerk. We are grateful. And anybody in Boone County is not grateful should be. Across the country, there's a lot of anecdotal commentary about difficulties in recruiting and retaining paid and unpaid poll-related persons. What's the situation here in Boone County compared to the past, compared to other counties in Missouri, and whatever you know about the nation?
I think, we have had to do more to entice people to serve as poll workers. We added a referral bonus for poll workers that successfully recruited people so that we could incentivize people. We are trying, this was, the hardest thing I think is that when the election is not very, very high profile, like a presidential election, there's not a lot of interest. And when there's not a lot of interest, there's not a lot of poll workers that are interested either. So we did a lot to network in the outer Columbia area to try to pull people in. We spoke to a lot of organizations. We put up flyers, and we did get enough. The hardest thing that we run into, and other counties run into this too, is it's important that we have bipartisan balance at our polls. And in Boone County, that means that it's really hard to get Republicans. And it also is really hard to get people to move from that just regular election judge, show up and do the job, to the supervisor status, where you have a little bit more responsibility. We had a lot of people that said, I just don't feel like I'm capable of being a supervisor, or I don't want that kind of responsibility. So that's been a challenge. It's certainly been something that moving forward, we're going to have to look more critically into. And some of that, the nice thing about having data is that then we can make really informed decisions about the number of poll workers that we have and all that kind of thing. But it's been hard. I don't think it's going to get any easier, but I don't know that it's worse than it has been. I think it's just really hard. Dave.
Hi, Brianna. Any idea if county clerks in the future might be able to provide a legal photo ID?
That is a really good question. It's one that I would really like to see. So for me, it's not a loophole, but in reading the law allows any sort of photo ID that is issued by the state with an expiration date.
Right.
That opens up the ability for the Secretary of State's office to offer a photo ID with an expiration date that could be issued through our offices. It is, and I will say, it's just an idea. It's not something that is coming to fruition or anything, I think, anytime soon. But that capability is there under the way the current law is written.
Have you mentioned that to our Secretary of State?
No comment.
Okay. I have a couple other quick ones. Are other counties doing the kind of data analyses you are doing? And does your analysis get shared with the Secretary of State or other county clerks?
Some are for sure. The larger counties definitely are. I mean, St. Louis County's data machine is amazing, and they have an in-house GIS department, and they do all kinds of really cool stuff. And so I can only aspire to their level of data nerdness and stuff. But I share whatever I put out, and usually when I make something that's into an interesting data, I put it out on social media too. And lots of times other counties will pick it up on social media and they'll share it that way. But in some ways it's just educational tool. So if I go, we had new clerk training. We have a record number of new clerks coming into the position. I think 34 out of 116
Wow.
are brand new. And so I went to county clerk training in December and gave the presentation on how to read a statute. Because there's one other attorney, but he's in St. Louis City, but there's no other county clerk that's a lawyer. And so I get tapped a lot to do those kinds of things. And part of that process too was talking about like, there's ways to get good information out of things. You can look critically at your current processes and see if there are ways to improve upon things. And that's the way that I get it out through other county clerks to try to encourage them to do that. Because when they're new, they don't know. And so if they just make it normal to look at these numbers, then they'll just do that.
Right. You mentioned how many provisional ballots, how many people showed up without the proper new ID. But what worries me a lot more is how many people just don't bother to try to vote because they don't have the right ID. And
Yeah.
how do we guess what that is?
So I have been trying to come up with a way to proxy that, because it's an ongoing question of why people don't vote in the first place. And I know how many people are registered to vote. I don't, registering people to vote is incredibly important. And I think that everybody that gets registered, everybody should be registered. We should have automatic voter registration. It should just be easy. But when you look then of, well, people took the time to go register to vote, but they didn't take the time to go vote. Why is that? That's the whole area of political science that's
Right.
working on that. But I think, we had good conversations with people. Lots of times it's nothing motivating on the ballot. I hate that so much of voter turnout is driven by the candidates and the issues that are on the ballot, but it is. And I think that to me, and what I've always said is, with all of these laws being in the news, whether they're good or bad or indifferent, people get intimidated and confused, and then they don't feel comfortable or knowledgeable enough to go and vote because they know that something changed in the law, but they don't exactly know what. They don't want to embarrass themselves amongst their friends when they go to vote at a polling place, and it's not worth their time unless there's something really, really, really important on the ballot for them. So I think it's hard to distinguish between who was prevented from voting and who self-prevented themselves from voting because we made everything so confusing for them.
Right. Thanks.
Sarah?
Mine is a quick one. So I went to the lunch and learn you did for the chamber before the election, and you mentioned junior poll workers or like younger people who could be like trained poll workers. And then I came home and told my kid, and his first question was, is it paid?
Yes, it's paid.
All right. I think I might have another one for you. Thank you.
Yes, so it's paid. It's the Youth Election Participant Program. We have them at every election now. There's a whole statute that lays out a youth election participant. It has some details for working in the April election that requires you to fill in a form, but it doesn't for August and November. And so for August and November, we just have people come back and we hire them. So yes, it's a paid position, and very few times have we heard somebody not have a good time while they're doing it. And the poll workers love it. They love having extra people. They love having someone with a lot of energy. And we love having people, especially with so much technology now in elections, that have more of an innate understanding of oh, this is how the iPad works that processes voters, so they can be trained very quickly, which is great.
Yeah. And what's the age on that for everybody else in the room?
So it's 15 to 17, but usually we get so many people, we end up taking the 16 and 17-year-olds because the 15-year-olds will have an opportunity when they turn 16.
Cool.
We had a 15-year-old at our polling place, and she was the best ever. She was spectacular.
Yeah, and selfishly, we're hoping they stay on as poll workers when they turn 18. And some of them do, but if they move away to college or something, we get a lot of people that go and be poll workers wherever the county is that they're moving to, which I think is fun.
Brianna, if you think of just doing a little blurb on that, we'll get that announcement out. We know a lot of families. We'll put it in our announcements for Muleskinners. But of course, it sounds like you get plenty. Thanks.
Carl, I don't know who had the question.
It's me. I'm sorry. It just took me a sec to unmute. My question goes back to the question of the difficulty of recruiting poll workers. And one of the things that I've kind of wondered about in the back of my mind is it's a very, very, very long day. And it's the set amount that people are paid is not that high if you factor it out by the hour. So is there any, I don't know who sets that legally, but is there any consideration of trying to increase the pay and or maybe have multiple shifts of people so they don't have to work?
So we are, I think, trying to explore potentially doing shifts. So increasing the pay, I will say, going back to the cost question of whether there were increased costs for this election, 70% of our election cost is the personnel of our poll workers. So even at the rate that we charge, if you look at the cost of our election, 70% of it is just the people. So we can increase it. It's not a statutory thing, but it increased the county cost. And then the other thing is, like for an April election, it increases the city's costs and the school district's costs and anybody else that has something on the ballot. So it's walking a fine line with that. But I know that the shift idea has come up lots of times, and Dave Taylor's brought it up before too. It is honestly at this point, the thing that kind of prevents it is I have one person that does all of the poll worker recruitment and placement and everything. She doesn't do all of the training. We have trainers that come in too, but she also organizes all the trainers. And in order to do all of the training that we do for this election, for example, we had about 600 poll workers. That was like 3 straight weeks of the way that we do training. So if we wanted to double the number of people we were using, because we were going to do split shifts, that's 1,200 people. Then we have to add all of their training into it and everything else that's happening. I am not opposed to that idea. That's why we're looking into it anyway, because it's something my poll worker coordinator wants me to look into because she wants to do that. But it's just a challenge to try to figure out like how are we going to do it within the confines that we have and the budget that we have and everything else. Because you're right, it would be easier to find people if we didn't say you got to work a 15-hour day. Pam.
I have 2 questions. One is I'd like you to tell us about your podcast, and I would like you to tell us about your process for removing dead people from the list.
Both excellent questions and not related, importantly.
Right.
My podcast is not about dead voters. No, that's a nice question. It is, I do it in my spare time. The High Turnout, Wide Margins podcast is a elections administration podcast because in my spare time, I still do elections administration. And it's co-hosted with the Democratic Director of Elections from St. Louis County. And we started it in 2020, the end of 2020 was our first episode. And we did 60 episodes our first year. And then we worked, if you go to KBAA's website, KBAA is producing it for us. We will have 26 episodes for this season, but it's far higher production value. So the first 60 episodes are me editing it at like 2 o'clock in the morning. So take it for what it is, but it was still fun to do. We interview other election authorities. We interview some of the nonprofits and NGOs. And then we were also very fortunate to, in June, go to Moldova and interview a bunch of people in Moldova and in Budapest because they were having a conference. The Association of Central and Eastern European Election Officials had disbanded earlier in the year because they were at an impasse about whether they should continue to have Belarus and Russia in their elections administration organization for obvious reasons. And instead of like coming to a decision, they just disbanded. But then they decided in June that they wanted to try to get together again and see if they could come to a consensus. And we were fortunate enough to be there for that. So we got to interview what do we call him? The elections director in waiting for Belarus, because he is the elections director for the duly elected president of Belarus, but not the sitting president of Belarus. So he is in exile in Warsaw. And it was a fascinating conversation. And then we've just been really fortunate to have those conversations. It's geared toward, I will not say that, it's nice that it's publicly available and things like that. It's not easy listening. It's very much for elections practitioners. So it's fun, especially like if you've been a poll worker, you can find an episode that's interesting. But even like my husband was like, I tried to listen to it and I got like 5 minutes in, and then I realized I have no idea what you're talking about. And it was really hard for me to understand. So it's great if you are super, super into elections. But it's also just been really fun. We did a live taping at Ragtag with a documentary called No Time to Fail, which documented the 2020 election in Rhode Island. And so yeah, that's been really fun. Dead voters, that is something that we do every week, usually more than once a week. We get updates from the state. We get information directly from the Department of Health and Human Services that comes through the state's voter registration database so that we can see potential matches of people to death certificates. We also have SSA, Social Security Administration integration. So if we have a piece of mail that gets returned that says that somebody was deceased, we can cross-check them and see if they actually are deceased, and then we can remove them from the roll. And then we do look for obituaries as long as we have an underlying reason. So we don't just take it on the obituary. We match it up with the Department of Health and Human Services, or SSA, to make sure we're not disenfranchising anybody. That's really important, is to err on the side of the voter. But, that's definitely an important part of list maintenance. And we do ongoing canvassing too. We send out letters to voters that we know have moved because we've gotten returned sample ballots. We do that all on an ongoing basis just so that we can keep in communication with people that may not be valid Boone County voters anymore because they've moved or for whatever other reason. So yeah, list maintenance is like when people say, well, what do you do when there's no active election? Like, list maintenance happens all the time. We're always doing that.
Right. Well, one of our local legislators, this is her thing, and I just always thought you took care of it. Maybe the other counties are not as good, but.
I think this is kind of going back to the number of new clerks that we have and everything else. The field of elections administration is kind of seeing an overhaul of new people coming in, and some of that institutional knowledge is lost. And if it's a process, if clerk has been doing it on their own and it's a 2-person office and the other person just didn't know that that was part of what the clerk was doing, and the clerk didn't write a manual of what they were doing, there might be 5-6 months where that process doesn't happen because they didn't know they were supposed to be doing it. Mm-hmm. But it's not like a nefarious thing. It's just literally a learning curve that we're up against.
Okay, thank you.
Dave, do you have another question?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, if there's anybody here who hasn't ever been a poll worker, you should do it. It's pretty rewarding and well worth doing, and you get to learn a lot about the process, and it's just nice to know that you're influencing people like that. And the other thing is, I think you forgot to mention which polling place had the most voters this past election.
Yes, Dave's wonderful polling place, the Ashland Optimist, was the #1 popular polling place. So
even more than the central polling places.
Even more than the centrals, yes. So if you look at on the county clerk's Facebook page, the last I can't remember what it was. It was in December. We put out like a week's worth of interesting data from the November election, and one of those was what were the top 5 polling locations. And yeah, so 3 of them were the centrals, but Ashland Optimus was the top one. So they're very popular. Ashland is very big into voting. And we've seen that actually they've been number 1 or so in the April elections too. I mean, even the April elections when we were only seeing like 13 or 14 or 15% turnout, Ashland's top in 30%.
Wow.
And this is Southern Boone. This was hardly even Ashland. It was the 2 most rural precincts in Southern Boone.
Yep.
I just want to point out there are a couple questions in the chat from Alice and Kathy.
Oh, let me see. How is Missouri's length of time for absentee voting compared to blue states? And restrictions in place for Missouri mail-in ballots. It is, so the fact that we have early voting at all, we were very far behind other states in, you know, to the extent that we can call it early voting. But to have a no excuse absentee period, that was not, even for our neighboring states, it was odd that we didn't have one. Illinois, Kansas, they all have some mechanism to allow people to cast a ballot before election day without having to state a reason. We were the only ones that had something in place. So it's nice now, at least, that we have 2 weeks. Everybody kind of varies with how long they give it because, like I said, there is some recognition that 6 weeks is a very long time to do in-person absentee voting with the cost that it costs to do that, and knowing that there may only be like 5 people a day. So I can understand it from that standpoint. And then restrictions for mail-in ballots. So this was one of the confusing parts of the law that made it extra confusing for educating people on absentee. There was really no change for mail-in ballots because mail-in ballots as a term only existed in 2020. Absentee voting by mail, nothing changed with that. It's always been the case. It actually got expanded a little bit because if you are an emergency worker, a member of law enforcement, a member of first responders, or healthcare workers, you can now vote mail-in absentee or during the first 4 weeks of the 6-week absentee process. So that got a little bit expanded to allow for, you know, shift workers that worked at hospitals never had the ability to vote absentee technically. And so they were always very frustrated that they'd be working 7 to 7. And yeah, technically, if they left their house at 5:30 to go to a poll at 6 and they were the first person in line before their shift started at 7, they'd have the ability to vote. But wouldn't it make sense to vote absentee? And there was never a way for them to do that. Now there is. So that was good. And then, let's see. Kathy had a question. Does the... So Kathy, yeah, those are the top ones. Kathy's question was, does the registration cutoff date need to be so far out from the election date? You know, I can argue it both ways because it's good to know the number of people to rely on for the number of ballots that we need. It's good to know for preparation of our polls and things like that. If all of a sudden like 2,000 people registered to vote right before the election that had never been on a roll before, it might throw off some of the planning that we do. But on the other side, there are plenty of states that have same-day registration and they make it work. And so if we were to go down that path, I would talk to those people and see how they made it work. So it hasn't really come up. I think that there's a lot of concern about us becoming a same-day registration state. There's no real consensus that we should be a same-day registration state. So it just really hasn't come up amongst the clerks. And then another question is local media encouraging citizens to vote. And I see some local media is on this call. The Missourian is great about it. Actually, I think the Missourian does a lot of really good work when it comes to like promoting out what the changes are and everything. And I can say that also because like they were in my office every day and we kind of cross-posted on TikTok channels and social media and stuff. And so like the Missourian is fantastic. Regarding like the rest of them, I always have a good working relationship with them, but when they get to choose what's going to be a story and what's not, it's really hard to make elections sound exciting. And so if something else is happening, we're just going to get bumped out of the local media. So the Missourian is probably the best because they have the bandwidth to have students do projects specific to elections. And when they want to do like an election center leading up to one of the major elections, then they can do it. But you know, I think probably it would be nice to see more new, like TV news do more that just talks about encouraging citizens to vote and things like that. So yeah, there's that. Nancy asked if the older podcasts are still available. Yes, if you go to that link that Dave put on there, that KBIA link, they're all on there. And then what percentage of eligible voters actually voted last November? About 40%. I think we got, let me find that. I don't think we broke 40%, but we got really close.
Thank you.
Oh, just kidding. I thought that we broke 50. So we were at 49% for November.
Oh.
So it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't the 60% that we were expecting based on the 2018 numbers. And the other thing that I like after the fact thought about was, well, 2018 was also the year that we had Medicaid expansion and we had right to work, and all of that was activating people through the summer and on the August election. And so by the time we got to November, everybody was like really keyed up because they'd been spending their whole summer and fall working toward an election thing. And our August was kind of lackluster this year, or, you know, 2022. So it was just hard, I think, to all of a sudden wake up a bunch of people that hadn't really been paying attention and just say, now's the time, let's go vote. So it was similar to 2014 when it was the same situation, and our turnout was pretty comparable. How many voters use the remote weekend voting? Each weekend voting that we did as a pop-up was about 100 people. I wrote the number somewhere, but I don't have it on me right now. But I mean, it was over 100 people. So every pop-up we had added more and more people, and they got more popular as time went on and we got closer to the election. And then we also had the office open so that people could come here too. So it wasn't just go to the pop-up or vote during the week. It was go to the pop-up or vote at our office. And I believe we were the only county in the state open on Sunday. Nobody else did Sunday voting.
It is about 6 minutes after 1, and we have been grilling her for a little over an hour at this point. We want to make sure to be respectful of her time so that she'll come back. So does anybody have like a final burning question? You've got 2 hands up, Pam and David. Do you want to duke it out?
There are some bills that have been filed, and I noticed one of them is to make the student IDs able to be used for voter ID. I guess that means it's going to have, they would have to have expiration dates on them.
Well, if they passed a bill that said that student IDs would be an eligible way, then they wouldn't. But if they didn't even pass that bill, if student IDs had expiration dates on them, then they could be used too, as long as you consider the University of Missouri a state issuing entity. So if the University of Missouri put expiration dates on their IDs, then they would be eligible. And Dave, we do have another polling place in southern Boone County. It is also popular. It's the Ashland Senior Center, and it's wonderful. And I'm so glad you brought that up.
We thank you very much.
Thank you all. It's always really fun I like being grilled for an hour. I don't mind.
Yeah, no, I learned a bunch. This was really informative. This is great. And it's great for looking forward to how we help you turn more voters out the next time. If we know where people are voting and where people aren't voting and what we think is motivating them, it helps us help you get those people out of their houses and out to the polls. So
Yeah,
thanks.
and if anybody ever wants to do a project or anything too, like this is I think the part where I think I could do I could enjoy more local coverage of. I have all this data available and I'm happy to share it with people. And so if somebody wanted to turn it into something, like I make those graphs and I, highlight those little things and stuff like that. And that's fun for me. I enjoy doing it, but I can only imagine if somebody had like Photoshop and can make stuff look really nice and make it into this nice little informative thing. I'm happy to share. All of it, I believe, is publicly available. So, you just have to really enjoy getting down into the weeds.
And I like you to do more videos of dancing across Broadway.
Thank you not merely for the competence which you clearly demonstrate, but for projecting the joy and the good humor in the grand tradition of some of our great clerks of the past, Chris Kelly, Wendy Norton, and so forth. That's what's due to our privilege, for our privilege to vote. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
And you're not allowed to run for any other office.
Unless you want to. Okay. Well, I think we're going to move on now to announcements.